In the North Atlantic in early 1941, convoy warfare was not a duel of courage. It was a ledger of endurance. A merchant convoy like OB-288 moved inside a narrow mechanical corridor, 8 to 10 knots in heavy weather, columns constrained by visibility and station keeping, escorts constrained by fuel consumption and boiler limits, and a protection model that assumed the attacker would reveal himself through haste. The British escort system expected a submarine to spend itself, battery, torpedoes, air, depth margin, while the convoy's geometry and the escort's search patterns forced contact to resolve quickly. The core limiter was time on station. An escort running hard turns and repeated ASTIC sweeps burned fuel at a rate that shortened its effective screen, and the convoy's slow speed meant the same patch of ocean remained relevant for hours, not minutes. U-96 was a Type VIC boat built for that exact corridor and punished by it. On the surface, diesels could hold sustained speed and recharge batteries. Submerged, every extra, not multiplied electrical drain and heat. The physical anchor that governed everything was battery capacity versus submerged speed. At patrol speeds around 2 to 3 knots, a Type 7 could remain submerged for many hours, but at 6 to 7 knots the usable window collapsed toward 1 hour, and at maximum speed it collapsed toward minutes. That simple curve turned caution into a survivability algorithm. Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock's reputation inside BDU paperwork was often summarized as careful, even conservative, because he repeatedly chose not to chase early contact in daylight and repeatedly disengaged when counterattack conditions favored the escorts. That was not temperament, it was power budgeting. By late February 1941, U-96 was deep into a long patrol cycle out of St. Nazaire, operating in waters where weather became a weapon against sensors. ASTIC performance degraded sharply as sea state rose because surface noise, aeration, and bubble layers cut the usable return. Escorts could still search, but their detection envelope became intermittent and short-ranged. The technical anchor here was propagation. ASTIC needed a stable acoustic path, and heavy seas made the water column an unreliable medium. A submarine that stayed patient could exploit the gaps when escorts were blind, not when they were alert. That inverted the psychology of the fight. The convoy looked safest when escorts were most active, but it could be most vulnerable when their sensor medium was worst. OB-288 was a westbound convoy that became a field for that inversion. When a wolf pack formed, the first phase was not the attack. It was the math of contact maintenance. A Type 7 shadowing on the surface at night could keep station with minimal cost, while a convoy could not change speed or course freely without breaking columns and signals. The physical anchor was turning radius and station keeping. Merchant ships could not execute repeated large zigzags without losing formation in darkness and weather, and escorts executing wide turns to prosecute a contact necessarily opened temporary lanes through the screen. Those lanes did not appear on charts. They appeared as a consequence of mechanical limits. Lehmann-Willenbrock's method was to treat the convoy like a moving factory line, not a target. He waited for the moment when escort motion created a predictable hole, then entered, fired, and left before the escort could convert reaction time into a closing depth charge pattern. The anchor was reaction time versus closure speed. A destroyer might make 25 to 30 knots, but it still needed minutes to confirm contact, alter course, accelerate, and lay a pattern. Those minutes were a corridor a surface U-boat could exploit, because the U-boat already had firing solution and did not need confirmation. The too cautious label came from the fact that he would abort an approach if the escort's geometry was not yet forced into that corridor. He was waiting for physics to lock the escort into a decision. When U-96 attacked in that February window, the weapon system itself imposed another limiter: torpedo reliability and depth keeping in heavy seas. German G7E electric torpedoes were slower but wakeless. G7A steam torpedoes were faster but left a visible track that could betray the attacker. In darkness and weather, wakeless shots reduced surface detection risk, but the slower speed reduced acceptable deflection angles and demanded closer range or better geometry. That anchor, torpedo speed versus target track, made the attack feel like a calculation rather than a rush. A cautious commander was not hesitating. He was waiting for the target's track to intersect a firing envelope that did not require a heroic guess. The convoy's response to damage created the next irreversible mechanism. When a ship was hit, it slowed, fell out, or stopped, and then the escort screen was forced to allocate assets. One escort to chase a periscope report, one to mark a datum, one to shepherd stragglers, sometimes one to pick up survivors or direct a rescue ship. The anchor was allocation. A screen is a finite number of hulls, and each hull can do one job at a time. Every time an escort peeled away, the screen's effective density dropped. A patient attacker did not need to sink the entire convoy. He needed to force the escort commander into a sequence of mutually exclusive tasks. Once the sequence began, the escort group could not undo it without abandoning something, either the convoy's integrity or the pursuit. When escorts did find a U-boat, the counterattack was not a duel, it was a stress test on metal and seals. Depth charges generated a pressure wave that attacked the submarine's weakest points: fittings, valves, cable penetrations, and battery casings. A Type VII survival margin was not its nominal crush depth on paper. It was its cumulative tolerance to repeated shock, especially when the boat was already operating with minor leaks, fatigue fasteners, and batteries producing gas under load. The anchor was cumulative fatigue. Even if a single pattern did not hit close, repeated patterns over hours raised the probability of a failure that forced surfacing. Lehman Willenbrock's caution was partly a refusal to remain in a depth charge box longer than necessary, because survival probability decayed with exposure time even without a direct hit. What made the episode operationally important is that it contradicted training expectations about initiative. Submarine officers were trained to value the bold penetration, the close-range solution, the decisive night attack. But the February 1941 Atlantic was already shifting. Escorts were learning, radar was beginning to appear in primitive forms, and escort commanders were rehearsing tighter night dispositions. In that environment, raw aggressiveness often shortened a boat's patrol life. The anchor that decided outcomes was not bravery. It was patrol persistence. Days on station multiplied by probability of contact. A commander who preserved batteries, preserved depth margin, and avoided prolonged counterattack could stay in the killing zone longer, which statistically produced more opportunities than a single dramatic penetration. U-96's documented third patrol results illustrate that logic. A long patrol with multiple contacts, including stragglers tied to convoys and an attack in conjunction with other boats against OB-288, produced a cluster of sinkings within a campaign rhythm that rewarded persistence. That is the system story behind the headline. Too cautious is what impatience calls resource discipline. In the Atlantic, resource discipline is what converts a fragile platform into an operational constant. The deeper implication is uncomfortable for any narrative that wants a single decisive maneuver. In 1941, convoy defense was not yet a closed technical loop. It was a learning system operating under constraints of range, fuel, sensor physics, and night visibility. A U-boat commander could exploit those constraints by refusing to fight the escort on the escort's terms. The anchor was visibility. Night allowed surface speed without wake discipline penalties, and poor weather degraded both lookout effectiveness and ASTIC reliability. Caution meant choosing the hours when the defender's instruments were least authoritative, then leaving before the defender's reaction could solidify into a pattern. From the outside, that looks like a wrong trick, a refusal to press, a habit of breaking contact, a preference for long shadowing and selective shots. From the inside, it is an engineering choice. Stay within battery curves, stay within hull stress margins, stay within torpedo envelope constraints, and you can apply pressure longer than the escort group can remain fully coherent. That is how a method that seemed useless to observers could outperform standard expectations in the operational reality of the Atlantic in early 1941, long before the air-surface radar net made patience less profitable. That framing choice mattered because HX-112 was not an isolated anomaly, but a recognizable expression of a broader Atlantic pattern that U-96 embodied earlier and more consistently than most boats. By March 1941, the convoy battle was already transitioning from episodic clashes to sustained pressure systems, where outcomes emerged from repetition under constraint rather than from singular decisive encounters. U-96's earlier patrol behavior made sense only when viewed through that lens. The The patrol cycle itself imposed another non-negotiable technical limiter: fuel and range. A Type VIC carried approximately 113 tons of fuel oil, translating into a surface endurance of roughly 6,500 nautical miles at 10 knots. Every hour spent sprinting to contact shortened time on station later, and every unnecessary course change increased consumption. A commander who pressed early contacts often paid for a days later, forced to break off patrol or operate with reduced mobility in the most dangerous phase. U-96 patrol logs show extended loitering patterns rather than aggressive interception arcs. That choice preserved a mobility reserve that only became visible when other boats had already exhausted theirs. This endurance logic interacted directly with escort doctrine. British escort groups in early 1941 were not designed for continuous pursuit. Their destroyers and corvettes were optimized for convoy shepherding, not extended high-speed chases. Boiler limits, crew fatigue, and fuel margins meant that escorts could not maintain peak readiness indefinitely. The physical anchor here was sustained output. Escorts could surge, but not persist. A submarine that avoided forcing that surge prematurely could reappear when the escort group was already operating below optimal efficiency. U-96's cautious contact discipline also exploited a temporal asymmetry in convoy defense. Escorts reacted to sightings and detonations. Submarines acted on anticipation. Reaction always lagged perception. In night surface conditions, that lag could stretch to minutes, during which a surfaced U-boat at 15 to 17 knots could reposition beyond the immediate datum before ASTIC search patterns even stabilized. The anchor was time lag. Detection, confirmation, command decision, maneuver, and weapons release formed a chain that could not be shortened beyond human and mechanical limits. Caution extended the number of times U-96 could exploit that lag. As the Atlantic campaign intensified through mid-1941, BDU analysis began to reflect this reality, though often indirectly. Reports increasingly emphasized contact maintenance and pressure over time, rather than immediate sinkings. This was not ideological change, it was data accumulation. Boats that survived longer patrols generated more contact reports, more coordinated attacks, and more cumulative tonnage destroyed, even if their individual attack runs appeared conservative. U-96's record fit that curve precisely. The misreading of this behavior persisted because training culture favored visible action. Aggressive approaches were easier to recognize and reward. Caution left fewer dramatic moments in after-action reports. Yet the Atlantic did not reward drama. It rewarded boats that remained operational. The anchor was attrition. A submarine removed from patrol by damage or battery exhaustion exerted zero pressure thereafter, regardless of how bold its final attack had been. This dynamic explains why the label "too cautious" survived alongside effective results. It was a semantic artifact of a system still learning how to measure success. Tonnage sunk per patrol day, not per attack run, was the metric that eventually mattered. U-96 performed well by that measure precisely because it avoided early self-elimination. By late 1941 and into 1942, Allied countermeasures would begin to erode the advantages patience once exploited. Extended air coverage, radar improvements, and HF/DF triangulation compressed the reaction lag that U-96 had used so effectively. But in the window before those systems matured, caution was not a weakness. It was a force multiplier operating quietly within the physics of batteries, fuel, acoustics, and human response time. Seen from that perspective, the connection between the brand framing of HX-112 and the operational reality of U-96 becomes clear. HX-112 symbolized the moment Allied planners recognized a failure of expectation. U-96 represented the method that made that failure inevitable under existing constraints. The convoy did not break because a commander was bold. It broke because the system could not sustain coherence against a unit that refused to hurry. The Atlantic in 1941 punished impatience. U-96 survived and therefore influenced outcomes by respecting limits that others treated as inconveniences. That is why a style dismissed as useless could outperform standard training. not by overturning doctrine, but by obeying the physical boundaries doctrine had not yet fully acknowledged. That distinction matters because the Atlantic campaign was not decided by isolated clashes, but by the cumulative behavior of systems under load. U-96's operational profile exposes how doctrine lagged behind physics. Training manuals emphasized decisive engagement, yet the environment punished decisiveness when it violated endurance curves. The boat's pressure hull, battery banks, diesel cooling limits, and torpedo envelopes defined a narrow operational corridor. Inside that corridor, restraint maximized influence. Outside it, aggression accelerated removal. The convoy defense model of early 1941 assumed that escorts, once alerted, could impose control. That assumption rested on two technical beliefs: that detection would be reliable, and that response could be sustained. Both were fragile. ASTIC required favorable sea states and stable platforms. Escorts required fuel margins that did not exist for prolonged pursuit. The anchor here was sustainment. A destroyer could sprint, but sprinting consumed boiler life, fuel, and crew capacity at rates that were not recoverable during a single convoy crossing. A submarine that forced repeated sprints without remaining present inverted the cost exchange. Each reaction cost the escort more than it cost the attacker. U-96's patrol discipline repeatedly triggered that inversion. By delaying attack until escorts were already maneuvering, it exploited the fact that escorts committed before confirmation. A suspected periscope report was enough to force a turn. A single detonation forced a pattern. Each commitment reduced future flexibility. The submarine did not need to win the encounter. It needed to survive it. Survival preserved pressure. Pressure forced escorts into decisions that accumulated error. This logic extended beyond any single convoy. Boats that returned intact provided intelligence continuity. Their crews retained experience. Their commanders refined timing. Losses erased learning. In 1941, German submarine losses were still within tolerable limits, but each loss disproportionately removed trained personnel. The anchor was human capital. Training a U-boat commander took years. Losing one erased not just a hull, but a decision-making engine. A cautious commander preserved that engine. U-96's approach also exploited the Atlantic's night geometry. In March at high latitudes, darkness dominated the operational cycle. Night reduced visual detection, degraded signaling, and allowed surface movement without immediate compromise. A surface type 7 presented a low silhouette, especially in sea clutter. Escorts relied on lookouts whose effectiveness dropped sharply with fatigue and weather. The anchor here was perception bandwidth. Human observation could not scale indefinitely, while a submarine's engines did not tire. Caution aligned action with the hours when human systems were weakest. As the campaign progressed, Allied adaptation targeted exactly these advantages. Radar reduced night invisibility. HF/DF reduced shadowing safety. Escort carriers closed the air gap. But those changes took time, production capacity, and doctrinal acceptance. In early 1941, they were incomplete. U-96 operated in the interstice between intent and capability, where the defender's doctrine assumed tools that were not yet reliably present. This is why retrospective judgments often mislabel the period. Success was not immediate domination. It was sustained disruption. Convoys like HX-112 became reference points because they forced recognition that escorts could not guarantee integrity under all conditions. U-96's earlier patrols demonstrated the method before the recognition crystallized. The brand narrative attaches to HX-112 because it was visible and painful. The operational truth attaches to boats that practiced patience consistently. The Atlantic did not reward innovation in the abstract. It rewarded alignment with constraints. Battery discharge curves, fuel burn rates, acoustic propagation, and human reaction times formed a lattice that defined what was possible. U-96 stayed inside that lattice longer than many contemporaries. That is why its commander's caution translated into measurable effect, even when observers mistook absence of spectacle for absence of intent. By mid-1941, the learning curve began to bend. Escort tactics tightened. Air coverage expanded. The window narrowed. But the lesson endured. Systems fail at their margins. not at their centers. U-96 pressed the margins quietly. It did not need to shatter doctrine openly. It allowed doctrine to exhaust itself. This perspective reframes the initial accusation. Too cautious was not a flaw. It was a diagnostic error made by a system that valued visible action over sustained pressure. U-96 demonstrated that, in the Atlantic of 1941, the most dangerous submarine was often the one that waited longest before being seen. That realization did not arrive as a formal correction. It emerged indirectly, through mismatched expectations and after-action reports and tonnage curves that refused to align with aggressive doctrine. Boats that pressed early contacts showed sharp spikes followed by abrupt silence. Boats that conserved, like U-96, showed flatter curves that extended across patrol weeks. The anchor here was patrol survivability. The probability of a boat remaining operational declined non-linearly with exposure events, not with elapsed time. Every unnecessary engagement increased exposure count. Caution reduced exposure count while leaving elapsed time intact. This mattered because the Atlantic was not a closed arena. It was a moving corridor where convoys passed through predictable latitudes and longitudes on fixed schedules. A submarine that remained alive could intersect multiple convoys on a single patrol. One that was damaged or forced home intersected none. The physics of range and refuel cycles imposed that asymmetry. Escorts rotated. Submarines once lost did not. The anchor was replacement time. Constructing a Type 7 required months. Training a crew required longer. Losses could not be rapidly amortized. U-96 restraint also intersected with torpedo economics. In early 1941, torpedo reliability was uneven. Magnetic pistols had already been largely abandoned after failures in 1940, but depth-keeping errors still occurred. A commander who expended torpedoes on marginal solutions risked returning with empty tubes while still in contact-rich waters. U-96 firing discipline preserved weapons for geometries that minimized failure probability. The anchor was inventory irreversibility. Once fired, a torpedo could not be replaced at sea. Aggressive doctrine treated torpedoes as a means to force engagement. Cautious doctrine treated them as finite leverage. The escort side experienced the inverse constraint. Depth charges were plentiful, but time-consuming to deploy effectively. A standard attack required establishing a datum, executing a run, dropping a pattern, and then circling back. Each cycle consumed minutes and displaced the escort from its screening position. In heavy seas, maintaining speed and heading accuracy during a run was difficult. The anchor was maneuver precision. Without precise speed control and steady headings, depth charge patterns dispersed unpredictably, reducing effectiveness while still exacting cost. As these cycles repeated, convoy coherence eroded. Not catastrophically, incrementally. A damaged ship slowed. A column compressed. A rescue maneuver opened a gap. None of these actions violated doctrine individually. Together, they created conditions that doctrine did not anticipate. U-96's approach relied on allowing those increments to accumulate before committing. That patience was mistaken for hesitation because its payoff was delayed. The broader system response lagged because feedback was delayed. Convoy battles were analyzed after the fact. Loss attribution was diffuse. Weather, chance, and enemy action blurred causality. It took multiple episodes before planners recognized that restraint itself could be an offensive tool. By then, the environment was already changing. Radar sets began appearing on escorts. Air patrol radii expanded. The Atlantic gap narrowed. The anchor was technological maturation. Once detection probability increased and reaction lag decreased, the margin patience exploited shrank. But in early 1941, that margin still existed. U-96 operated inside it deliberately. Its commander's choices mapped closely to physical ceilings. Battery discharge curves, fuel burn rates, hull stress tolerances, and human fatigue thresholds. Each decision reduced the likelihood of catastrophic removal. Over time, that reduction translated into influence disproportionate to the drama of individual attacks. This is why the title framing persists. The criticism, too cautious, was not wrong in tone. It was wrong in diagnosis. It assumed that caution reduced effect. In the Atlantic of 1941, caution redistributed effect over time. It transformed a single vulnerable platform into a recurring pressure source. Convoy HX-112 became the moment that forced recognition, but U-96 had already demonstrated the method earlier, quietly, in patrols where success looked unspectacular but accumulated weight. Understanding that distinction is essential to understanding the submarine war before the balance shifted. The Atlantic was a system still learning its own limits. U-96 did not exceed those limits. It waited for them to bind its opponent. That waiting produced a strategic echo that was easy to miss at the time because it did not announce itself a spectacle. The Atlantic's accounting was cumulative. Every convoy forced to scatter, every escort compelled to abandon optimal station, every night spent reacting rather than controlling, pushed the defensive system closer to saturation. U-96's behavior mattered, not because it shattered a single convoy outright, but because it demonstrated how pressure could be sustained without triggering decisive counteraction. The anchor here was saturation threshold. A system can absorb shocks individually, but repeated minor shocks compress its margin until recovery becomes impossible within the available time window. British escort doctrine in early 1941 was still calibrated to episodic contact. A submarine was expected to attack, be driven off, and then disengage permanently. That expectation shaped escort behavior. Once a contact was broken, escorts often returned to station assuming the threat had passed. U-96's refusal to fit that pattern, shadowing again, reappearing later, striking only when geometry favored it, forced escorts into a state of permanent alert without permanent control. The anchor was crew endurance. Human operators degrade under sustained vigilance far faster than mechanical systems operating within design limits. Fatigue widened reaction times and narrowed decision quality. This asymmetry became more pronounced as patrol days accumulated. A convoy crossing the Atlantic might spend 10 to 14 days at sea. Escorts rotated in and out of readiness. Crews slept in short cycles. Sensors were manned continuously. A submarine that survived the early phase of a patrol could meet the same convoy under progressively worse defensive conditions. The anchor was temporal decay. Defensive effectiveness declined with time on task, while the attacker's effectiveness, if it remained intact, could remain constant or even improve as patterns became predictable. U-96's log entries from early 1941 reflect that logic indirectly. Contact reports emphasize position maintenance and timing rather than immediate attack. That emphasis conflicted with pre-war training ideals, which favored decisive engagement. Yet the Atlantic punished decisiveness when it forced the attacker into exposure states. U-96's restraint minimized exposure states. Each avoided depth charge run preserved hull integrity. Each avoided high-speed submerged chase preserved battery margin. Those margins compounded. They did not appear in single action summaries, but they shaped patrol outcome. The convoy system's vulnerability lay in its dependence on coordination. Escorts, merchants, and command centers were linked by radio procedures that imposed delays and rigidity. A sudden course change required signaling. A damaged ship required instructions. Radio silence, often maintained to avoid HF/DF interception, limited flexibility further. The anchor was communication latency. The time required to disseminate decisions across the convoy prevented rapid reconfiguration. A patient submarine exploited that latency by forcing small disruptions that could not be immediately corrected. In this context, HX-112's later breakdown can be read not as an outlier, but as a visible convergence. By March 1941, enough of these pressures had accumulated that a single convoy battle exposed the fragility of assumptions. U-96 was not the sole actor, nor even present at HX-112 in the decisive role, but its earlier patrols embodied the same method that made HX-112 inevitable under existing constraints. The system was already stretched. HX-112 merely revealed the tear. From a technical standpoint, the lesson was not about a particular weapon or maneuver. It was about operating within limits until the opponent exceeded theirs. The Atlantic did not reward those who tried to force outcomes. It rewarded those who allowed outcomes to emerge from constraint interaction. Battery curves, fuel consumption, acoustic degradation, human fatigue, and communication delay formed a mesh. U-96 stayed inside that mesh longer than most. The escorts did not. By the time countermeasures matured, radar integration, coordinated air, sea patrols, improved depth charge patterns, the margin had closed. Patience no longer guaranteed survival, but that later reality should not be projected backward. In early 1941, patience was an offensive asset. U-96 demonstrated that by turning restraint into repeatability and repeatability into pressure. The Atlantic campaign before mid-1942 was a contest of learning rates. The side that learned faster under constraint gained temporary advantage. U-96's method accelerated learning on one side, while delaying decisive adaptation on the other. That imbalance explains why a style dismissed as wrong could outperform standard training for a critical window of time. The historical scale of this episode only becomes clear when the Atlantic is viewed not as a battlefield, but as an industrial system under adaptive stress. In early 1941, neither side yet possessed a closed solution. Detection was partial. Coverage was discontinuous. Command chains were slow. Victory did not belong to the side with the boldest maneuver, but to the side that aligned its behavior most closely with the environment's hard limits. U-96 mattered because it exposed that alignment earlier than most. The dominant illusion of the period was that initiative created advantage. In reality, initiative often accelerated exposure. Every aggressive pursuit forced a submarine in a higher battery draw, increased acoustic signature, and reduced depth margin. Every prolonged counterattack forced escorts into fuel depletion, crew fatigue, and positional distortion. The Atlantic punished whichever side crossed its thresholds first. U-96's commander understood, intuitively and operationally, where those thresholds lay. His restraint was not passive. It was calibrated. This reframes the meaning of convoy battles like HX-112. They were not singular turning points born of surprise. They were moments when accumulated pressures exceeded the system's capacity to mask them. HX-112 forced Allied planners to acknowledge that escort doctrine, as then practiced, could not guarantee coherence under sustained submarine pressure. That realization did not come from one bold act, but from repetition made visible. U-96's earlier patrols contributed to that repetition by demonstrating that survival and persistence were themselves offensive tools. In the longer arc of the war, the window that favored such methods closed. Radar erased darkness. Air patrols erased distance. Escort carriers erased the Atlantic Gap. Submarines that survived by patience in 1941 were destroyed by persistence in 1943. The physics changed. The system adapted. What had once been restraint became insufficiency. That transition underscores the central lesson. Tactics are only effective inside a specific technological and environmental envelope. Outside it, they decay rapidly. Yet it would be a mistake to judge early war commanders by later war outcomes. In 1941, the Atlantic was still undecided because neither side fully understood the system it was operating. U-96 represents the moment when one actor briefly aligned doctrine with reality before reality shifted again. Its story is not one of heroism, nor of genius, but of fit. Fit between machine, crew, environment, and time. The accusation of being too cautious endures because it reflects a persistent human bias, the tendency to equate visible action with effectiveness. The Atlantic disproved that bias. Effectiveness belonged to those who remained present long enough for pressure to accumulate. U-96 remained. Others did not. In that sense, the significance of U-96 lies beyond its tonnage figures or patrol reports. It illustrates how wars are often shaped not by decisive blows, but by methods that exploit limits quietly, repeatedly, and until adaptation arrives. For a brief but critical period in the North Atlantic, caution was not the absence of courage. It was the correct reading of the system.